It's the week ending Saturday the 2nd of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen long queues forming outside forecourts as a petrol delivery crisis gripped the UK. Wayne Couzens handed a whole life sentence for the murder of Sarah Everard, and Sir Keir Starmer signalling a clear break from Corbynism in his first in-person speech to a Labour Party conference. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And before we start, a note from the producer, a correction. In episode 244, apparently we said there are only 2 white rhinos left in the world. Now, a quick Google will alert you to the fact that this is very much not true, but it is true of northern white rhinos, of which there are only 2 females left. So may I apologise on behalf of the show to all rhino lovers for our accidental inaccuracy there. Joining us today, the last rhinos of journalism. From The Week Junior, it's editor Felicity Capon. From Money Week, Mr. John Stepek. And from your second favourite Olly Mann podcast, The Retrospectors, it's freelancer Arion McNicoll. John, you are kicking us off today. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are we about to unleash frankenfoods on the English public?
DEFRA sets out a number of statements which I would have issue with. It sets out that gene editing is exactly like natural selection or natural breeding techniques, and it simply isn't. If it were, we wouldn't have agri-tech companies about to spend literally billions of pounds, billions of dollars, billions of euros doing something they could effectively do now. So number one, the consultation process is flawed.
Shane Holland, Executive Chair of Slow Food, being accompanied by some irritating piano at politics.co.uk. John, what has happened this week? What's the story?
Well, basically, the Environment Secretary, George Eustice, has announced that England is set to relax the regulation of gene-edited crops. Now, this is a sort of shift away because we've left the EU. The EU currently has basically the strictest rules in the world on genetically modified crops. And they're 2 separate things here. There's genetically editing and genetic modification.
And what's the difference? Because editing sounds somehow less frightening than genetic engineering as well as genetic modification, but it is all changing the genes of plants, isn't it?
That's basically the idea. So with genetic modification, as I understand it, GM crops often have extra genes inserted in them. So basically, you can get a wheat sheaf crossed with a jellyfish. For people who want glow-in-the-dark cereal, as obviously we all do.
Now you've said it.
Yeah, I know. I quite fancy that.
Desperately want that.
Get Kellogg's onto it right away. But gene-edited ones just have genes snipped out of them. So I suppose you can sort of think of it as being genetic modification is the kind of mutant stuff, and the gene editing is kind of sculpting your cereal into a more marvellous version of itself.
Yeah, well, in the DEFRA tweet that was put out, Felicity, to reach functional idiots like me, the example they gave is that it could remove, for example, allergens from produce like sesame and peanuts, so that they'd be safer to eat for people that are allergic. Just snip out the problematic gene. That's kind of how they're selling it to us.
Yeah, and it's quite an attractive sell. DEFRA said the changes could lead to sugar beet resistant to viruses, wheat and potatoes edited to reduce a naturally occurring chemical. There could be wheat that's safe for people with gluten allergies, which for a lot of people would be a game changer, I imagine. Rice that produces 30% more grain for each plant, which you can see that in a world where climate change and all sorts of other things are going to affect crop yields, this could be science's answer to how we feed the population. And I mean, it's something that I think is already underway, and there'll be sort of trials and tests to make sure it's safe, I assume. But there's the Roslin Institute at Edinburgh University. I think they've developed pigs which are immune to a reproductive and respiratory syndrome, and that disease actually costs the European pig industry nearly £1.5 billion a year.
Well, hold the phone right there, Arion, because, that mention of pigs takes us beyond plants immediately, doesn't it? And again, animals is the thing people are nervous about. Is that where this is heading?
I think that's right. I mean, there are a few fears that people who object to these changes have cited. And one is that this could result in the breeding of the kinds of livestock that could be kept in worse conditions because it's easier to keep those breeds that way. But I think people are also afraid of plants which are more resistant to chemicals, and that food that's produced in this way may have unintended negative health impacts, and also that we'll see less diversification of not just crops but also animals, that we'll have fewer species of pigs and fewer species of wheat, and that could be negative. And I think sort of even more broadly than that, there are fears among a lot of people that this is one of those cases of humans threatening to play God. That's the sort of overarching thing, that this is people meddling with nature in ways that we just really shouldn't be.
Yeah, and it's being sold as well, John, as something we can do, something Britain can do because of Brexit, because it isn't permitted in the EU. But, well, first of all, why isn't it permitted in the EU? Why aren't they on board with it? And secondly, will that then affect, do you think, our exports to the EU, which is our most important market?
Firstly, it's banned in the EU basically because they've taken a blanket approach to genetically modified foods. So GE, or genetically edited stuff, is treated in exactly the same way as the genetically modified stuff. And I think that, to use a clearer version of the genetic editing, the idea with genetic editing is that it's a faster way to do selective breeding. So the idea is basically just speeding up the natural way that we've been doing things for a long time. Whereas obviously, you would never normally be able to cross a jellyfish with a sheaf of wheat, without using something scientific. So the idea is just accelerating the natural process. And to be fair, the EU has got the strictest rules in the world, so that's different to, America, Japan, etc., etc. In fact, Japan, they've recently launched a heart-healthy tomato, which has got extra lycopene or whatever it is in tomatoes that's meant to be good for your heart.
Well, we've got a deal with Japan, haven't we? A trade deal. So is that what this is about then? Because to go to the second part of my question, is this about allowing America and Japan to sell us what they already have and we can export to them, and it's even less trade with the EU?
Well, I think that's an interesting point. To be honest, it's one of these things that has been a lot of, like, scientists in the public sector, people involved in this are actually quite pro it. So I'm not sure that it's just about that. Obviously the government is keen to show benefits of Brexit, but this is a fairly minor step in the direction of loosening the restrictions around things like actually genetic modification, which obviously people are much more concerned about. And I think that that's also one reason why, because when you look at people objecting to this, a lot of the time they're not objecting explicitly to gene editing. They're objecting to the idea that this is the thin end of the wedge. And it's one of those classic areas where people think, if you let them, take an inch, they'll take a mile kind of thing.
Yeah, you do wonder whether the survey questions are fair, Felicity, because I've got a stat here from one of the surveying organisations that 87% of Brits surveyed viewed gene-edited crops as a greater risk than traditional crop breeding methods. Well, yeah. If you're pitting it against traditional crop breeding methods, which would you rather put in your mouth? Most people would probably say, just, better safe than sorry. I'd rather not have the one that's been tampered with by science. But that doesn't mean that 87% of Brits say we definitely shouldn't be doing this if the benefits are explained.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a sort of a huge lack of knowledge around what it actually involves, and probably quite a big dose of fear about what it could sort of turn into. And I wonder whether just, the mention of Brexit, whether it is also a political issue. If you're a Remainer, you're going to hate this anyway. And if, you have the government sort of flying the flag of how wonderful Brexit is, you're just going to sort of instinctively be opposed to it without sort of knowing. I feel like I sort of like swallowed the gene edited Kool-Aid a little bit. I sort of feel like it's quite a good thing. And I think it's also pointing out that it's actually quite close to a technique that's already employed, which is something called radiation breeding. And this is where seeds are exposed to radioactive sources to induce mutations in their DNA. Most mutations are irrelevant or harmful, but some are beneficial and can be used. And it's a sort of way of speeding up evolution. I don't know. I feel like the more you look into it, there are sort of benefits to it. And there are ways that there are already similarities in techniques that have been employed so far. And also its inventors, I think they won the Nobel Prize for this. It's not It's not just some sort of random Brexit thing that's come along.
Isn't it interesting, Arion, that Felicity, our resident greenie, has basically said, I'm convinced by this because it's good for the planet. And certainly that case is being made. Whereas usually people who really are very proactive on green issues would also take a stance on, we need to be doing everything organic. We need to go back to nature. We need to stop meddling.
I think that's right. And I think partly what we're talking about here is a way to get those people who may have an antipathy, a natural antipathy to this kind of meddling with nature, for lack of a better word, to be on board. And they have done exactly what John's talking about, which is to break it down into small and potentially digestible component parts. So, this immediate move of separating out genetically edited crops from this broader category of genetic modification, I think is a step to allowing people to go, well, actually, that doesn't sound so bad, and so maybe I can get on board with that. And then the sort of further steps that the government is planning to take in the years ahead will become more palatable as people see maybe the advantages of this and the lack of downsides.
To be fair, on the EU side, they're planning to review their GM legislation apparently later this year. So it sounds like this is something that they're looking at separating out as well. So it's quite possible that for the moment we'll be slightly ahead of the curve, but chances are this is going to be something that kind of takes off across the board.
Is it not just a way of furthering corporate interests as well, though, rather than tackling the underlying problems faced by agriculture? Because isn't it a bit like lab-grown meat? I mean, in the sense, if you develop a new vegetable by taking a gene out of it, then don't you own that vegetable in a way that, hitherto in human history, John, no one's been able to say, I own carrots. You'd be able to say, well, the super carrot that grows like this that Waitrose want to buy, I own that. It's patented. It's mine.
I mean, there's an element of that sort of thing with all of these organisms. I don't know enough about intellectual property on these specific things because, there's lots of different rules that govern all of these different areas.
But even if you just own the science, like even if there isn't a patent, even if you're the only guy that can make that carrot, then you are making it a corporate thing, aren't you?
The thing is, though, I mean, then you have to just sort of part that and think, well, how much of this is us getting into superstition and a sense of smash the corporations because we're talking about an emotive subject? Because, the vaccines were all made by big corporations and some of them made money out of it. And actually, in fact, the only one that didn't was AstraZeneca. But at the end of the day, that's the kind of useful mechanism for getting science progressed. I mean, that basically boils down to, do you prefer something to be governed by the private or the public sector?
Sort of, but there isn't a naturally occurring vaccine, is there?
No,
that's the difference.
No, that's
at the moment, anyone can plant a vegetable.
Yeah, but I mean, you're not going to displace, not all carrots are not suddenly going to be owned by, Monsanto or something like that. And also, a lot of companies have steered clear, like in Japan, again, the tomato thing. A lot of companies have steered clear of doing anything that is genetically edited, even though they're allowed to, because consumers don't really like the idea. They find it a bit icky. I mean, that's fundamentally always been the big problem. And the good news is that as long as you maintain labelling, which we're going to do here, then consumers have the choice. And ultimately, a lot of the time, consumers choose not to eat these things because there is that slight thing of, well, I don't really want something that's been genetically modified or edited or fiddled with.
But how clear is that labelling going to be, Arion? You do wonder, don't you? Like, if you're making the organic product, that's going to be shouted loud and proud in your graphic design, isn't it? But if you're genetically edited, it's not going to be called Tesco's finest genetically edited celery, is it?
Maybe not in the early days, but I think as people become cooler with the idea of eating this sort of food in the first place, they will maybe relax their ideas, and maybe it will be a matter that brands can actually make a song and dance about. But just on that question of motivations, I think a lot of particularly the scientists who are interested in this sort of thing have perfectly legitimate reasons for wanting to develop the field of genetic editing itself. And I read this really persuasive article by a food scientist called Nick Talbot in The Guardian, where he was talking about the fact that he studies plant diseases, many of which he says are a serious threat to humankind. And he said that his main obsession is this thing called the rice blast fungus, which he says destroys enough rice each year to feed 60 million people. And so in his view, if we can start to solve these kinds of diseases, and he says genetic engineering and editing is one of the ways to get there, then we can really feed more people. So it's not necessarily that businesses are underpinning this from a malevolent point of view. There's a lot of reasons why scientists want to advance the science for really legitimate human ends.
I completely agree. I don't think it has to be, I think it can be mutually beneficial that corporate interest will be involved, and actually it kind of pushes the frontier forward. I think they can go hand in hand. And, we are where we are with the fate of the planet being what it is. I think something that could come along and revolutionise how we feed people, I'm sort of all in favour of it, really. And the other thing is I know we don't want to go on to this, but even the idea of using it in human patients, there could be even that doesn't horrify me totally. I mean, I think it's been used to treat sickle cell anemia in a small number of human patients.
You don't get to smuggle in eugenics in the last 10 seconds of
yes,
the
discussion.
Can of worms.
Always with the eugenics.
I love it.
We'll very much return to that another day, I suspect, in more depth. Arion, you're up next after this. Okay, Arion, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learned that stealing people's jokes is no laughing matter.
So I went into Curry's, right? I'm going up to the fridges, right? I look at the fridges. I want to see this nice black one I like, right? And a guy comes over to me and goes, "Oh, sir, I see you've seen our smart fridge." I was like, "Hold on, what's a smart fridge, bruv?" He's like, "Well, this one, sir, it connects to the internet." I was like, "Listen, the last thing I need when I come home from work is my fridge asking me for the Wi-Fi password, bruv, right?" He's like, no. What happens is it will send you a text message when you need something, right? I looked at him dead in the eyes and I was like, "Bruv, I'm not married for a reason, right? I don't want to be out with a lad. Suddenly I get a text message and I'm like, oh." My friend's like, "Is that the fridge again?"
Comedian Kay Kurd on Jonathan Ross's Comedy Club on ITV last year. Arion, why are you playing us this?
Well, so even though that gig was last year, something has happened this week that is significant, which is that jokes from Kay Kurd's routine that he did on the Jonathan Ross Comedy Club on ITV, gave him this massive exposure to a nationwide audience, were heard by one of his fellow comedians, a guy called Darius Davies, and he then started telling people that, in his view, this followed a really similar structure to his own routines and had a bunch of jokes that he regarded as having been lifted pretty much wholesale from his own work. And he then started to make something of a public song and dance about this in various videos comparing his routine to Kurd's. And that resulted in this now potentially landmark court case where Kurd is now threatening to take Davies to court for libel. So he's saying, not only did I not steal your jokes, but also you saying that I stole your jokes is potentially damaging to my career. So at the center of all of this is this really big question, which is, can you prove that someone has stolen your jokes?
And there are some pretty serious law firms involved in this, aren't there? I mean, I wonder whether this will ever get to court, but still the threatening letters are being written by some serious people.
Yeah, that's right. So Kurd has hired Harbottle and Lewis, who are the lawyers best known for representing the Queen and the rest of the royal family. So, this is high stakes and high level stuff if, as you say, it gets to court.
I mean, it sounds a bit like just a wounded ego, Felicity, on the behalf of Kurd, who also has some high-profile talent representation within the industry as well, that other comics were saying, "We know you stole this joke." It does seem an incredible coincidence that Darius Davies did do a routine with the same four cornerstones of observation. It wasn't just the punchline 5 years prior to him being on TV. I mean, that seems irrefutable. So the question is, was he just hurt by the fact that this was pointed out publicly rather than sort of sorted out amicably?
Yeah, it sounds like a bruised ego. I do have sympathy with him because that's your livelihood and your reputation at stake, and just the way that anyone would be aggrieved by having their work plagiarized. I understand that. At the same time, I imagine that the way in which we tell jokes in the age of internet and TV has just completely transformed. And I imagine to some extent, benevolent plagiarism is going to be more par for the course and more inevitable, because you have people posting comedians' routines online, and they can be more easily shared. And some people will, I'm sure, willfully copy them, and other times it will just sort of seep into your mind, and without thinking that you'll accidentally sort of all be saying the same kind of jokes. And I think it's probably entirely reasonable to suggest that in this day and age, comedians will be taking the same kind of subjects and topics as their inspiration, and coming up with slightly the same kind of routines. And I mean, like in the smartphone era, I think there's more awareness of the dangers of joke recycling, because I think a lot of audience have to give up their mobile phones when they go into somewhere so that they're not so readily stolen. But I'm sure this is just sort of something that comes with the territory of being able to have your routines on TV and on social media, and people sharing them much more widely than they ever could do before.
I mean, John Davies, perhaps being charitable about this now, has said that he thinks that Kurd genuinely does think that he wrote it. But that, since he knows that he wrote it 5 years prior, what must have happened is that they were sharing a bill in a comedy club, and Kurd saw the routine, then forgot that he saw it, went and wrote his own routine that was very similar, and then ended up doing it on telly, which is why he was offended by the accusation of plagiarism. I mean, it's funny, even if you take it out of comedy, I mean, even in this environment, current affairs, I'll be researching a discussion that we're going to have, and I'll read a comment on the Telegraph website or something, or on the New York Times, and I will find myself parroting out something that sounds a bit like that, because sometimes when someone says something elegantly and articulately, it's in the back of your head, and it becomes, if you agree with it, it becomes something that you say, even if you're not aware that you're not going to credit the source every time.
It's such an interesting case, because it actually raises an awful lot of questions about an awful lot of things, including the somewhat unfair structure, or arguably unfair structure, of the whole libel system in the UK, whereby the more money you've got, the more clout you have. So I mean that's one kind of big issue. I mean, the things, you can't copyright an idea, because obviously, I mean, I work in finance, and I remember one of my journalism tutors basically saying there are only 6 stories in finance. Some tax insurance and 4 other ones. And then it's just a matter of repeating them over and over again in a more elegant way.
Subscribe to Money Week, everybody.
Yes, do. You need to be told these things over and over.
Elegantly repackaged every week.
Exactly. In this, it sounds as if the guy saw his routine. I mean, I don't find either of the routines terribly funny, but that's not the point. The point is that this other comedian isn't as successful as Kurd, and it must be quite galling. And you hear this a lot, actually, because I've got a few people I know who are comedians or have worked in the industry, and there is sort of poaching, and it's frowned upon. And obviously comedians themselves, to be a stand-up comedian, you have to have a certain type of personality, and that type of personality is, I don't think it's unfair to say that it's fragile to an extent, because, it simultaneously takes a lot of courage, but also quite a lot of neediness to stand up in front of people and run the risk of, making a complete, I'm allowed to say arse?
Yes, do.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't remember the rating on this. Make a complete arse of yourself in public, as I've just done. But it's so I think that it's not surprising it's got to this point. It's kind of nuts that it's got to this point.
But just to your point, John, on the question of people copying each other and how rife it is in the industry, apparently there are loads of illustrious copycats out there. Robin Williams was apparently notorious for recycling gags on primetime TV that he had heard in flea pit comedy clubs the night before. And Richard Pryor proudly admitted to taking jokes from other people and was once quoted as saying, "I made a lot of money as Bill Cosby."
Bravely chosen 2 dead comedians to slander there, Arion. But also, it's from that era, isn't it, Felicity, that it starts to become a problem, in the sense that, rather like with pop music, where you have bands writing their own songs, 60s, 70s, 80s onwards. Before that, it was, Bob Hope would quite openly be, they'd get paid, but he'd quite openly just be taking gag writers and doing their jokes, didn't necessarily write much of his own material at all. Whereas now the suggestion is, this is all my personality, this is what I think. You do wonder if K. Kurd did indeed essentially steal Darius Davis's material. If he'd just said, look, I'm going on Jonathan Ross's show, do you mind if I do something based around your bit? They might have settled it over a pint.
Yeah, I mean, if it was a sort of, if you could, maybe it's how you choose to see it. If you can see it as a sort of imitation as the highest form of flattery, and if we're all constantly borrowing in each other's ideas and sort of improving them and making better, and that's how we get better jokes and better stories and better plays. I also think it's just ironic because the idea of comedians going to court and getting incredibly kind of like sour-faced and bitter, just, you know, they really completely don't have a sense of humour, and you do sort of think it would be much better if they, you know, settled this over a pint rather than going to court where like huge sums of money would be passing back and forward. And I mean, the only ones laughing all the way to the bank would be the lawyers, really.
Well, there's also the psychological effect, isn't there, John, of receiving a letter like this on your doorstep, particularly if you are, you know, the less famous, less well-remunerated comic. I mean, it's a horrendous thing to go through, isn't it, when you know that very well-paid advisors are writing a threatening letter saying they're taking you to court.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that sort of nods back to what I was just saying about the libel law thing. There is a chilling effect from libel law, because basically you need a lot of money to sue someone, and you also need a lot of money to defend yourself. I mean, as the Guardian points out, you know, if Davis actually wants to end up defending this in court, he's going to need to, you know, raise like tens of thousands of pounds in legal fees.
But also the sums of money involved are unusual, Arion, because, you know, if you take the music example, this isn't like Oasis borrowing from Gary Glitter, is it? Where you've got two big hit songs and a lot of money in that era had been spent on buying them. You're talking here about like a guy no one's heard of being on a TV comedy show that, yeah, okay, it's on ITV, but, you know, has a relatively small audience for ITV. One joke that's part of his, you know, he probably got paid 700 quid for the appearance. You know, yes, he'll get booked to do Nevermind the Buzzcocks, but it's not as if he's going to get millions of pounds because he told this joke, is it?
No, but I suppose it speaks to the future career of both of them. And I was kind of reflecting on the fact that once you've said a joke on TV, even if it's to a smaller audience, it probably is a comedy-loving audience, and you've probably burnt that bit. You know, that bit you can't then just take out and do again. And if also that bit came out of someone else's mouth, and you're then up on stage, and you're doing it, and you know it's yours, because it was yours, but people say to you, having seen it on television in someone else's mouth, that actually they think it belongs to that other person, you can see how this could end up being this massive double blow for Darius if there's truth in his claim. First of all, that he's had his material stolen in the first place, and second of all, that he's the one being taken to court. So he may end up in, you know, legal jeopardy as the sort of consequence of his joke being stolen. So it's this really difficult case, if indeed it's true that his jokes were stolen.
Although, you know, if you are someone who goes to stand-up clubs a lot, Felicity, it is really tedious watching someone that you've seen before do the same joke themselves, even if it's their routine. I do kind of think this might kick all stand-ups up the arse, to borrow John's word. Might kick them all up the arse to come up with, you know, more original material more regularly, not just peddle the same thing since 2015.
Yeah, it's going to go one way or the other. It's either going to have a chilling, stifling effect, or it's going to hopefully help people to raise their game. But I think you're right. I mean, the audience, if they've heard a joke before, it's not funny anymore. So I think there's always going to be that incentive that it's got to be good, it's got to be original. And if you plagiarise it, I mean, I imagine the types of people who like to go to comedy shows will have heard it before and will not be impressed.
All right, Felicity, you will be raising our game after this. Felicity, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
I don't have time to do this podcast clip. I'm too busy manifesting.
Every single moment in your life has brought you to the present moment. You are constantly attracting things into your life without even realizing it. The law of attraction, simply put, says that you will attract into your life what you focus on. You can attract negative things into your life, and you can attract positive things into your life. When I say I'm going to be teaching you how to manifest, what I really mean is how to manifest intentionally, because you are actually already always manifesting. You cannot stop, and there is no pause button in life, obviously.
Thankfully, there is a pause button on that video. YouTuber Naomi Rosenthal talking there about how to manifest anything you want back in 2020. Felicity, why is this your story of the week?
It was an article in the Times, which I just thought was absolutely fascinating. It sort of pointed out that videos with I'd never actually come across manifesting before, but obviously now I'm an avid fan. That and gene editing are my new two favourite things. But videos with the manifestation hashtag have been viewed a whopping 10 billion times on TikTok. The term started to spike in 2018. And last year, between March and July, Google searches for the term rose by 669%.
What does it mean?
Well, it can sort of mean anything you want it to, really. It's the idea that if you want something, you manifest it. You ask the universe for what you want, and lo and behold, the universe will give it to you. There's quite a lot of different ways you can do it. So one method is called scripting. There's the 369 method, where you write down what it is that you want 3 times as if it's already happened. So you could say, I'm so grateful that I passed my exam. Then 6 times you write the action. I'm so grateful that I got 75% in my exam. And then 9 times the emotion. I feel ecstatic that I passed my exam. You can tell from that example that the biggest kind of audience for this sort of thing seems to be teenage girls.
Yes, who are, after all, probably readers of The Week Junior just a few years ago, Felicity. So
Yeah,
you are spending your time talking to people who shortly might be into this. Does that make you feel worried for their future as teenagers, or does it make you feel kind of, it's quite sweet, really?
I sort of think it's quite sweet. I know that people do have serious concerns about manifesting, but I just can't seem to work myself up into finding it that worrying. I mean, at a time when, anxiety levels and depression levels and self-harm and goodness knows what is really skyrocketing, the idea that you would sit down, get out your diary and engage in some positive thoughts about what you want and what you hope to achieve doesn't seem to me to be that worrying. It sort of seems like lots of fads that you can get into, like crystals or essential oils or tarot cards. I think they're kind of a bit of fun. It's kind of a bit of positivity. I don't think it's this crazy thing that we really need to worry about. I just think it's so interesting that it is a new trend that's emerging.
Well, and of course it's anything but a new trend in another way, Arion, because it for the past 5,000 years has been known as praying, and more recently as cosmic ordering or The Secret or whatever. But I mean, it's positive thinking and asking for stuff you want. It's not new. It's like an essential baked in part of the human condition, isn't it?
Yeah, I massively see that comparison with prayer. Maybe the only difference is that you're taking gods out of it. It's looking to some sort of higher power, but that power just exists in and around us, more like the Force, I suppose, than some sort of biblical thing. But as you say, even those deep roots gave way more recently to this thing that Rosenthal mentioned in the clip that we heard at the top there, which was this law of attraction, which was one of the pillars of the New Thought movement, which occurred in the 19th century, which was a spiritual movement that began in the US that was really trying to synthesize the best bits of ancient thought. And that was the accumulated wisdom of ancient Greeks and Buddhists and Egyptians and kind of everyone, swirling it all together into this one new form of belief. And that law of attraction was then really mainlined by a writer called Rhonda Byrne. She was this Australian who wrote a book you may have heard of called The Secret that came out in 2006, and it went on to sell 30 million copies. And her central thesis was that anything you want could be achieved by this 3-step process, which went ask, believe, and receive. And that's kind of given birth eventually to this more contemporary version of manifesting that we're seeing now.
I suppose the danger, though, John, is kind of sweet if the expected outcome happens, i.e. you ask for something, the guy you fancy from school doesn't ask you on a date. Your heart's broken, but then you've learnt an important lesson. Life is hard and bad things happen to good people. The danger, it strikes me, is if it does happen. Like you get the thing you wanted and then you just become an absolute manifestation freak, like an evangelist, when clearly there is no scientific basis for this.
See, I think that's interesting. Fundamentally, this is just the flakier end of self-help. And all self-help is basically about sitting down, working out what your goals are, and then finding ways to push yourself towards them. And manifestation is just goal-orientated thinking, but in this case, for teenage girls on TikTok, but cosmic ordering was the thing that Noel Edmonds sort of said that he did, and that's how he became famous. And this was, 15 years ago. And cosmic ordering was very similar. It's like you kind of talk to the sky and ask it for what you want. But the key point is knowing what you want. So it's that kind of like obsessive focus on what your goal is that then directs your actions towards achieving that goal. And I know I sound a bit kind of flaky here, and that's fair enough, but that's the fundamental basis of all self-help. And whether you then achieve that through visualizations or achieve it through a more what we would term a kind of normal way, which would be to write down your goals for this week or this year and then say I'm gonna achieve these. It's the same thing, really. It's just appealing to different people.
I also see another potentially non-flaky version of the power of positive thought in those professions that are performance-based, like you think of athletes or public speakers or whatever. I remember in that amazing Michael Jordan documentary that came out last year, one of the things that he was talking about what made him such a good athlete was that whereas he thought that other players at key moments in big games might imagine themselves missing the target, he was like, well, why would I ever think that I would miss? He just had this mentality of, I know I can do this. Give me the ball. I'm going to go and do this.
Yeah, but he was already Michael Jordan. I mean, that's a crucial difference, isn't it? And Felicity, I'm the same. Like if I'm, I don't know, presenting an award ceremony, right? Then before I go on stage, yes, I might say to myself, I'm Billy Crystal. I'm going to own this. Yeah, of course. But I've already been chosen for that job. I'm already in that position. So visualizing a positive outcome, that doesn't seem like a completely insane thing to do. But the problem here with manifestation is you're sort of saying you can wish away all of your circumstances.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the criticisms of it, that people sort of say, well, if you're poor or you're ill or you've had a rough life, is that all your own fault? Is that the sort of the universe picking on you?
Exactly, yeah.
But I mean, I think as long as you treat it with a dose of, if you're kind of realistic about it, I'm more leaning towards Arion's side of things, and also what John was saying about even knowing what your goals are. For a lot of people don't know what they want from life or what they can achieve or anything. To have goals and to have a kind of a positive mentality, I mean, the psychological is incredibly powerful, and it is linked to, what you can achieve is definitely linked to your mental state. I mean, if you're stressed, you release cortisol, which has a negative effect on you. I don't see why that manifesting couldn't produce the opposite of that and actually have some kind of like biological effect on you. And also when you think about like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which a lot of people advocate and support, to me it seems like this is the opposite of catastrophizing or spiraling, these terms that you go down the worst possible thing is going to happen, I'm terrible at everything. This just seems like the opposite of that. I can do this, I can get my dream job, I can have this, as long as you're slightly realistic about it, I just don't see how it can be all that negative. And I agree, people who would sort of come back and say, well, this is just delusional. I mean, you could say that about religion and spirituality, and all these things are actually incredibly meaningful to people.
And I do. But I'm going to manifest the end of the show right now, because that is what I would dearly love to happen. And glory, the universe has delivered it to us. My thanks to Felicity, John and Arion for their stories. Remember to follow this show for free, or just manifest that you will follow it on your podcast app of choice. Search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.